I used to work at a diner in a small Nevada town right off a desolate stretch of highway. The kind of place where truckers stop for coffee and pie before disappearing into the night. My shifts often ran late, and I'd drive home in the early hours, the desert stretching endlessly on either side of the road. One night, as I was driving home, my car radio started to crackle. Static filled the speakers, followed by faint snippets of a voice, too distorted to make out. I switched it off, but the unease lingered. About 10 miles from town, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, barefoot and dressed in what looked like a hospital gown. Her long hair was matted, and her head was tilted at an odd angle. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. As I passed her, she turned to face me, her eyes wide and unblinking. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. Not walking away, not fading into the darkness, just gone. A minute later, my car engine sputtered and died. I coasted to the side of the road and tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. The desert was silent except for the faint sound of wind. And then I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet ahead of me, her head tilted further, almost unnaturally, as she took a slow step toward the car. I locked the doors and reached for my phone, but there was no signal. The figure kept moving closer, and I could see her face now, pale with sunken eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide. The next thing I remember, it was morning. I was sitting in the driver's seat, the car engine running, parked on the shoulder of the road. My watch said it was 8 a.m., but it felt like only minutes had passed. I drove straight home, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When I got to the diner later that day, I told my coworker what had happened. She looked at me, her face pale. "You're not the first," she said. "There's a story about that road. People see her, and then they lose time. Some of them don't come back." It was my sophomore year at a Midwestern college, and I was living in an old dorm building that had seen better days. The rooms were small, and the creaky wooden floors amplified every sound. My roommate Jess and I weren't best friends, but we got along well enough. She was often out late, hanging with her boyfriend, so I had the room to myself most nights. One Thursday evening, I was studying late for an exam. Jess had mentioned she'd be staying over at her boyfriend's place, so I didn't expect to see her. Around midnight, I heard the familiar click of the door unlocking. I glanced up, expecting her to walk in, but the door didn't open fully. It creaked slightly and then stopped, just barely ajar. "Jess!" I called out. No response. I got up and peered through the crack. The hallway was empty, but the key Jess used was still dangling from the lock. I stepped out into the corridor, feeling a chill that didn't match the building's usual draftiness. No one was there. I locked the door and returned to my desk, trying to convince myself I was overthinking things. Maybe she forgot something and left quickly. But as I sat down, I noticed her side of the room. Her closet door, which had been closed earlier, was now slightly open. "Jess!" I called again, louder this time. My voice wavered. Silence. I walked over to the closet, every step feeling heavier than the last. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. It was empty except for her clothes and a faint smell, something earthy and damp, like rotting wood. I shut the closet and went to bed, leaving the desk light on. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like it was coming from the walls. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw a shadow pass across the room. "Jess?" I whispered, but I knew it wasn't her. The whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. I felt a weight on the bed next to me, like someone sitting down. Too terrified to move, I stayed frozen until the first light of dawn. The next morning, Jess came back to grab some clothes. I told her what happened, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, her face went pale. "I never left my key," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We told the RA, who brushed it off as someone sneaking in or a prank. But after that night, Jess moved in with her boyfriend permanently, and I never stayed in the room alone again. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, in an old Victorian house my parents inherited from my grandparents. The house had history. It was one of those places you could tell had been lived in for generations. Its quirks didn't bother me much, at least not at first. There was a basement door in the kitchen that my mom always kept locked. She said it was for our safety since the stairs were steep and rickety, but something about it didn't feel right. There were times late at night when I'd hear faint noises coming from below, like whispers or footsteps. My dad shrugged it off as the old pipes settling. My mom never talked about it. One summer night when I was 16, I stayed up late watching TV in the living room. Around midnight, I heard a creak from the kitchen. My heart skipped. I muted the TV and listened. Another creak followed by what sounded like a soft knock on the basement door. I froze. I told myself it was the house settling or maybe a raccoon outside. But then the knock came again, louder this time. I slowly got up and tiptoed to the kitchen, every step making my heart race faster. The basement door was ajar. I was sure my mom had locked it earlier. She always did. The chain lock dangled loosely, swaying slightly. I stood there staring at the door, debating whether I should close it or wake my parents. Before I could decide, I heard a faint voice from the basement. It was a child's voice. "Help me," it whispered. My blood ran cold. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door wider, shining the beam down the dark, narrow staircase. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, about halfway down, I spotted movement, something small darting out of the flashlight's beam. My breath caught as the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, help me." It sounded like a little girl, but there was something wrong about it. The tone was off, like someone mimicking a child. I stepped back, my hands shaking so much the flashlight beam wavered. That's when I saw it. A face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural smile. It peeked out from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, staring straight at me. I dropped the flashlight and slammed the door shut, locking it and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my parents what happened. My mom went pale, but my dad laughed it off, saying I must have been dreaming. That evening, while my dad was at work, my mom pulled me aside. She told me about the family who lived in the house before us. They had a daughter who disappeared when she was 8 years old. They searched for weeks but never found her. Eventually, the family moved away, leaving the house to my grandparents. They always thought she fell down the basement stairs, my mom said, her voice trembling, but they never found her body. We moved out of that house a year later, but I still have nightmares about the face in the basement. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that same whisper. "Help me."